It's like Black Sabbath stuff, it's just really heavy.
Ah! They from LA?
Yeah, I think so.
Rock world is reeling today after Guns N' Roses frontman Axl Rose broke his decades-long silence about his infamous feud with Kurt Cobain and Nirvana in a bombshell interview that has fans of both legendary bands completely stunned. At 63, the notoriously private singer has finally addressed one of rock's most heated rivalries of the 90s, and his revelations have sent shockwaves through the music community. "I've carried this weight for 30 years," Rose revealed in an emotional sit-down that was intended to promote GNR's upcoming tour, but quickly veered into unexpected territory. "Everyone thinks they know what happened between me and Kurt, but the real story is so much more complicated, and so much worse than anyone realizes." The bad blood between Guns N' Roses and Nirvana has been well documented over the years, from Axl's initial admiration of Nirvana, even wearing their cap in the Don't Cry video, to Cobain's repeated rejections of Axl's offers to collaborate, culminating in the explosive confrontation at the 1992 MTV Video Music Awards. But according to Rose, what we've known until now has only scratched the surface. "People think I was just some egomaniac who couldn't handle being rejected," Rose said, visibly emotional. "The truth is, I was desperately trying to connect with Kurt because I recognized something in him that terrified me. I saw where he was headed, and I wanted to help pull him back from the edge." In perhaps the most shocking revelation, Rose claims that his infamous 1992 on-stage rant in Orlando, where he called Cobain a fucking junkie with a junkie wife, and suggested they'd go to prison if their baby was born deformed, wasn't the vicious attack it appeared to be. "That night in Orlando, I'd just gotten off the phone with a mutual friend who told me Kurt had overdosed again," Rose claims. "I was angry, I was scared, and yes, I lashed out in the worst possible way. I regret those words more than anything I've ever said in my life. I was trying to shock him into getting help, but I just ended up becoming the villain in his story." The interview, conducted at Rose's Malibu home, a far cry from the chaotic environment he once thrived in, reveals a man who seems haunted by the past. Surrounded by memorabilia from his 4-decade career, including platinum records and vintage guitars, Rose appears more introspective than the volatile frontman who once dominated headlines. "Looking back now, I can see how everything spiraled," Rose continues, gesturing toward a framed photo from the early 90s. "We were both at the height of fame, both struggling with the spotlight in different ways. I acted out by showing up late to shows or walking off stage. Kurt acted out by retreating further into himself and deeper into addiction. We were both crying for help, just in completely different languages." Rose also addressed the 1992 MTV Video Music Awards altercation, where tensions between the bands reached their breaking point after Courtney Love taunted him, asking if he wanted to be their baby's godfather. The night devolved into a series of confrontations, including Duff McKagan and Chris Novoselic nearly coming to blows, and an attempt by GNR members to tip over Nirvana's trailer. "That night at the VMAs was a complete disaster," Rose admits. "When Courtney made that comment about being the godfather to Frances Bean, it wasn't just some random taunt. She knew I'd been trying to reach out to Kurt privately about getting clean. It felt like she was mocking something that was genuinely important to me." What makes Rose's revelation particularly startling is his claim that he had been attempting to organize an intervention for Cobain through mutual friends in the industry. "I'd seen too many talented people destroy themselves," Rose explains. "I'd watched friends die from the same demons that were clearly consuming Kurt. So yes, I reached out through people we both trusted, trying to set up some kind of meeting away from the cameras and the bullshit." According to Rose, his concern for Cobain wasn't just about music rivalry, but stemmed from his own struggles with substance abuse and mental health. "We were more alike than either of us wanted to admit," Rose reflected. "But while I had survived my demons, I could see Kurt was being consumed by his. I recognized the pain behind his eyes because I'd seen it in my own mirror." Rose reveals that at the height of Guns N' Roses' success, he was battling severe mental health issues that were largely undiagnosed at the time. People saw the tantrums, the no-shows, the chaos, but they didn't see the panic attacks, the crippling depression, the nights I couldn't leave my hotel room because the thought of facing a crowd terrified me, Rose confesses. When I looked at Kurt, especially in those last interviews, I saw that same terror magnified 1,000 times. The interview takes an even more somber turn when Rose discusses what many fans didn't know: that Guns N' Roses bassist Duff McKagan was one of the last people to speak with Cobain, sitting next to him on a flight from Los Angeles to Seattle just days before his suicide in April 1994. When Duff told me about that flight, about how he almost invited Kurt over because he seemed so alone, Rose paused, visibly struggling with emotion. That destroyed me for years. I kept thinking, what if I had been on that plane instead? What if I had been able to put aside our stupid feud and just talk to him, human to human? Could I have made a difference? McKagan, who joined Rose for a portion of the interview, shared his own recollection of that fateful flight for the first time in detail. Kurt and I talked about addiction recovery, McKagan explained. He seemed interested in how I'd managed to get sober after nearly dying from pancreatic failure in 1994. There was a moment when we landed in Seattle where I thought about asking him to come over, maybe continue the conversation in a more private setting. I didn't follow that instinct, and 3 days later, he was gone. That's something I'll carry forever. Rose revealed that McKagan has never fully recovered from that chance encounter. Duff carried that weight for years, still does. The idea that he was one of the last people to speak to Kurt, that he recognized something was wrong but didn't follow through. None of us have ever really gotten over what happened. In one of the interview's most surprising moments, Rose admitted that Nirvana's musical criticism of Guns N' Roses had merit. When Kurt said we had nothing to say, that stung because part of me wondered if he was right, Rose confessed. They were changing music while we were becoming exactly the kind of rock stars we had once rebelled against. I didn't want to hear that truth back then. Rose reflected on his own trajectory from hungry, street-smart rocker to stadium-filling superstar. We started out as the antidote to the hair metal scene, these raw, real outcasts making honest music. By the Use Your Illusion era, we had become this massive machine. Private jets, ridiculous riders, egos out of control. Kurt called us out on that, and instead of listening, I lashed out. The revelations have sparked intense reactions from fans of both bands, with many expressing shock at Rose's newfound vulnerability, and others questioning his motivations for speaking out now. Dave Grohl, Nirvana's drummer and now frontman of Foo Fighters, has yet to comment publicly on Rose's statements. The interview reveals that Rose has attempted to contact Grohl privately several times over the years, seeking some kind of closure. Dave and I have had a few conversations, Rose admits. Nothing deep or dramatic, but enough to establish a mutual respect. He's been through his own hell, losing not just Kurt but also Taylor Hawkins recently. There's an unspoken understanding between us now that transcends whatever bullshit happened in the 90s. Music historian Elena Reynolds puts the interview in context. This feud has always been portrayed as a simple clash between glam metal and grunge. But Axl's revelations show it was much more personal and complex. He seems to be grappling with genuine regret and the realization that beneath all the public drama, there was a human connection that might have made a difference had pride not gotten in the way. Reynolds points out that the feud between Guns N' Roses and Nirvana has often been used as a symbolic representation of the changing of the guard in rock music during the early 90s. Guns N' Roses represented the excess of the 80s rock scene, while Nirvana epitomized the stripped-down, anti-establishment ethos of grunge. Their clash was perfect theater for a music industry in transition. Rose also addressed the moment in 2016 when Grohl loaned him the famous throne chair he had used during performances after breaking his leg. Rose had broken his foot just before Guns N' Roses' reunion tour and used Grohl's throne to continue performing. When Dave offered me that throne, it felt like a peace offering. Not just between us, but something Kurt would have appreciated too. The irony that I was literally sitting in something Dave created wasn't lost on me. In some weird way, it felt like closure. The throne incident marked a public thawing in relations between Rose and the former members of Nirvana. Former Nirvana bassist Chris Novoselic even tweeted support for Rose at the time, a dramatic shift from their near-fight at the 1992 VMAs. Rose also reflected on an incident that has become legendary in rock lore, when Cobain allegedly spit on Elton John's piano at the MTV Awards, mistakenly believing it was Rose's. That story always made me laugh, Rose admits with a rare smile. It was so perfectly Kurt, this defiant gesture that ended up hitting the wrong target. Elton told me about it years later, and we both agreed it was strangely poetic. Here's Kurt, trying to strike out at what he saw as excess and pretension, and he ends up hitting one of the most legitimate artists in music history. Perhaps the most revealing part of the interview comes when Rose discusses his reaction to learning of Cobain's death. "I was in a hotel room in New York when someone from our management team called with the news," Rose recalls. "My first reaction wasn't sadness or shock. It was anger. I was furious at him for giving up, furious at myself for not trying harder to break through all the noise between us. It took me years to understand that anger was just grief in disguise." Rose admits that following Cobain's death, he spiraled further into his own destructive behaviors. "I didn't handle it well," he says simply. "The next several years were a blur of bad decisions, isolation, and my own struggles with depression. In some ways, Kurt's death was a preview of my own disappearance from public life after the Use Your Illusion tours ended. Indeed, after the conclusion of GNR's mammoth Use Your Illusion World Tour in 1993, Rose became increasingly reclusive, eventually spending nearly 15 years working on the band's follow-up album, Chinese Democracy, which became notorious for its extended production time and massive budget. "I withdrew completely," Rose explains. "Part of that was my own mental health issues catching up with me, but I'd be lying if I said Kurt's death didn't affect my perspective on fame, success, and what really matters. I watched how quickly the world moved on, how his pain became entertainment, and I wanted no part of that machine anymore." As the interview continued, Rose addressed how the media portrayal of the feud has affected his relationship with Love and Frances Bean Cobain over the years. "I've never spoken to Frances directly," Rose admits. "I've seen her at industry events, but I've kept my distance out of respect. As for Courtney, we've had a few brief conversations over the years. Nothing substantial, but enough to establish that we're both different people now than we were in 1992. Rose reveals that he sent a private letter to Frances on her 18th birthday, apologizing for his public comments about her parents and expressing regret that she grew up without her father. "I never expected a response, and I didn't get one," Rose says. "It wasn't about making myself feel better, it was about acknowledging the harm my words might have caused her." The conversation shifts to how Rose's perspective on his rivalry with Cobain has evolved with age. "In your 20s and 30s, everything feels like life or death," Rose reflects. "Every perceived slight becomes this massive betrayal. Now at 63, I look back and see two young men who were both drowning in their own ways, lashing out because they didn't know how else to cope with success neither of them was prepared for." When asked if he believes things could have ended differently had he and Cobain managed to sit down and talk honestly, Rose becomes contemplative. "I don't know," he says after a long pause. "Kurt's demons were profound, and I was hardly in a position to save anyone back then. I could barely save myself. But I think about that alternative timeline sometimes, where we found some common ground instead of feeding the media narrative of this great rock rivalry." Music industry veteran Thomas Jensen, who worked with both bands during the early 90s, provides additional context to Rose's revelations. What people forget is how isolated someone like Kurt or Axl becomes when they reach that level of fame, Jensen explains. Everyone around them has an agenda, everyone wants something, and it becomes nearly impossible to trust anyone's motives. In that environment, reaching out to a perceived rival would have required tremendous vulnerability that neither man was capable of at the time. As the interview concluded, Rose was asked what he would say to Cobain if he could speak to him today. "I'd tell him I'm sorry," Rose said without hesitation. "Sorry for not finding a better way to reach out. Sorry for making it about my ego instead of his pain. And I'd tell him that the world has been a less interesting place without him in it for these past 30 years. Rose also expressed regret about how the feud affected the other members of both bands. Slash wanted nothing to do with any of it, Rose says with a rueful smile. He just wanted to play guitar. Dave and Chris lost their friend and bandmate. And yet here we all were, feeding this ridiculous narrative about which band was better or more authentic. None of that mattered in the end. Fan reactions to Rose's revelations have been swift and divided. Longtime Nirvana supporter Brian Goldby commented, "It wasn't a feud. Kurt thought Axl was a scumbag and wanted nothing to do with him, and that upset Axl very much." Others, like Chelsea Gusek, viewed it more humorously. "Kurt, I don't want to be his friend. Axl, and I took that personally. Slash, and I did not give a fuck." Social media has exploded with reactions, with the hashtag #AxlOnKurt trending worldwide within hours of the interview's publication. Many fans expressed shock at Rose's vulnerability, while others remained skeptical about his motives for speaking out now. "I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually feel bad for Axl Rose after reading this," wrote Twitter user @NirvanaForever90. "For decades we've painted him as this villain in the Kurt Cobain story, but maybe it was more complicated than that." Others were less impressed. Classic Axl, making someone else's tragedy about himself, commented Instagram user @GrungeQueen76. Kurt wanted nothing to do with him for good reasons. Axl represented everything Kurt stood against. The interview has reignited interest in both bands, with streams of their catalogs reportedly surging overnight. Music critics are now reassessing the infamous rivalry in light of Rose's revelations, with many noting how the passage of time has seemingly softened the once volatile frontman. Who comes out on top in this decades-old feud? Probably Dave Grohl and Slash, the two with the most talent and smallest egos, noted one fan, echoing a sentiment shared by many in the wake of Rose's confessions. Cultural critic Nathan Williams sees Rose's interview as part of a broader trend of aging rock stars confronting their legacies. "There's a reckoning happening with the surviving icons of the 80s and 90s, Williams observes. As they enter their 60s and 70s, many are looking back at their behavior during their peak years with new perspective and, often, regret. It's fascinating to watch someone like Rose, who epitomized rock star excess and volatility, grappling with his past actions in such a public way." The interview also touched on how the music industry has changed since the height of the Guns-Nirvana feud. Back then, these rivalries sold magazines, concert tickets, albums, Rose notes. The industry fed on conflict because conflict was profitable. Now with social media, artists can speak directly to fans without those filters. "I wonder how different things might have been if Kurt and I had been able to communicate without all those barriers and agendas." Rose also reflected on how the perception of mental health issues has evolved since the 90s. Back then, if you were struggling, the attitude was basically tough it out.